Good morning friends, welcome back to NPTEL online certification course on Indian poetry in English. Till now we have been discussing the first phase of Indian poetry in English, and as you might remember well that in the previous lecture we talked about Sri Rabindranath Tagore, one of the major voices of Indian poetry in English. But equally important is a voice which we are going to discuss today in the lectures that follow. And this voice is none other than Sri Aurobindo, who I think all around the world has become famous because of his seminal work named Savitri. My dear friends, I have divided this lecture into two parts. In the first part, we shall be talking about Aurobindo's life, his other achievements, influences, and then some of his works, and in the second one that will be more detailed, we shall be talking about Aurobindo's Savitri. But before we begin, let us have a look at who Aurobindo was and what was the political condition during that time when Aurobindo appeared on the Indian literature in English and especially on the scene of Indian poetry in English. My dear friends, you might well remember that in 1857 the Sepoy mutiny took place, and once the Sepoy mutiny was over, all the leaders of Indian political struggle, they became conscious. There was a sort of new generation, and this sort of consciousness could not be kept away from even the poets. India, being under the alien rule, was having all sorts of experiences, and at that time these experiences were recorded through literature, both by poems and also by prose. I think when freedom struggle took its or gained its momentum, more and more voices in prose appeared. Of course, in poetry there were only a few, and those few really made a lot of noises, and a lot of inspiration actually could be procured through these poets. When Sri Aurobindo appeared on this scene, I think there is much to know about how Aurobindo appeared on the scene, because as you might remember well that most of the poets of the first phase, they had an attraction towards English education, and many of them also went to England to see that they were well qualified, and of course some of them returned. You might well remember when we were discussing Tagore, we talked about how Tagore too was influenced by the Western education, and it was only in that age that there were some poets who were affected by a sort of mysticism, and there was a sort of reflective mystical verse or romantic Victorian verse, since many of them were affected by Western voices. So, it actually gave a new rise, or it provided a sort of emergence of some of the poets who were not only confined to their tradition, but they are also trying to do something new, and one of these such voices was Sri Aurobindo Ghosh. Now, let us have a look at the bio of Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo Ghosh was born in 1872 in a Bengali family in Calcutta, but my dear friends, he did not spend too many years in India, because one of his elder brothers named Manmohan Ghosh, who also was a very famous poet. So, along with him, only at the age of 7, Aurobindo also went to England, and he stayed there till he was 21 years. So, he had all sorts of education. Many people often said that Aurobindo did not know much of Bengali language because he could not spend his beginning years in Bengal. And when he returned to India, what he said, when he returned to India, he felt that there was a new charm, There was a new calm that descended upon him, far from the pall of England, far from the murkiness of England. And when he came back to India, he actually got a job in the Gujarat state, especially in Baroda state from 1893 to 1906. It is said that here was the period when Aurobindo not only started writing, but he also wrote some of his major poems. But why Aurobindo became famous, that we shall discuss when we proceed in this lecture further. Aurobindo was actually radical when he saw that India was undergoing a sort of freedom struggle. His views became very radical, and at times he also had been sent to jails on several occasions. It is said that when he was sent to Alipur jail, he actually got a lot of time where he says that he felt a sort of mystic experience, a mystical experience, and he says that during those hours it appeared as if he was having a sort of darshan, he was having a sort of Narayan darshan, and it is from there that whenever he went to any jail or whenever he was put into isolation, he actually had a sort of different feeling, an emergence of a new wave that is already reflected in the poems that Aurobindo wrote. Actually, it is so said that when he was in Alipur and later on he was also in Muzaffarpur jail, but then at the advice of some of his friends, he escaped to Pondicherry in 1910 and spent his entire life there as a spiritual guru. Pondicherry at that time was a French colony, and it so happened that he was visited by one very famous French lady named Mira Richard, who actually found in Aurobindo a guru, and both of them finally decided to establish Aurobindo Ashram in 1926. My dear friend, this man had a life, this poet had a life which in one word we can say he was not only a poet, but he was a yogi, because during the hours of silence, during the hours of his mystic experience, when he wanted to communicate, but he actually took an inward journey, and then he felt that he had the visions, and in his visions he created certain things which actually even today he is remembered for that. So, it is Sri Aurobindo who actually gave a new dimension, a new face to Indian English poetry, and we can never forget Aurobindo. Now, initially when Aurobindo started, since he was influenced by Western thoughts, some of the Western poets as well, even the early romantics he was influenced by, he was also influenced by some of the Victorian poets. So, we can find in Aurobindo's poem a sort of lyricism, and his poems can be considered to be lyrical, narrative, philosophical, because he turned inwards, and then there was a sort of epical sweep in his poems. We will see when we discuss his works. Aurobindo, as we have already said, that he was radical in terms of his views, but he did not devote much time into politics. From politics he actually made an escape route and came to the world of poetry, but through the world of poetry also he created a sort of revolution in the minds of Indians, in the minds of prosperous poets and writers, and one can find in Aurobindo's poems a sort of audacity. Of course, his works are full of technical innovations. You will find that he was not like other poets who will believe in creating a sort of metrical composition and simply providing a sort of melody, but rather at times he also started writing, he also started adapting to blank verse in poetry, and that is why in most of his poems, which are very longer, you will find majority of his poems are quite longer, and then we find that not only is he experimenting with the blank verse and majority of his poems are longer, but he kept into consideration that he should see, because in his psyche there was Indian ethos, Indian mythologies, Indian myths. Of course, at times he had to change it in order to serve his own purpose better. And so, initially he had started with some short poems, and the short poems were of various natures, but once he started writing longer poems, the longer poems had the background of ancient Indian history, ancient legends of India, and but then love happened to be at the core of majority of his poems. Love was in the background. So many people often say that the three epyllions that he composed, or three narratives that he composed, they actually have a central theme, and which we can call as the epyllions of love, the epyllions of love. So, the very first was Urvashi, then came Love and Death, and then came Baji Prabhu. We shall also give some discussion to it. Now, in all these poems, you will find, while Urvashi, all of you are familiar with the name Urvashi, and then Baji Prabhu is actually, it talks about the exploitations of military warfare and heroism, and in the background is Shivaji. And Baji Prabhu was a soldier who actually could not allow the enemies to enter Shivaji's camp, and it is said that he was able to withhold the enemies for more than 2 hours before Shivaji could return safe to his camp. Now, talking about Urvashi, we will see that Urvashi is out and out a love poem, and here you will find for the first time that Urvashi is not only written in blank verse, but it has got around 1500 lines. Majority of them are written in blank verse. The story goes well, that ancient legend of King, it is based upon the love between Pururavas and his love for Urvashi. It is said that in order to gain the favor of Urvashi, this person, I mean Pururavas, did not think much about his own people, even though he was a king. And the entire poem, Urvashi, is full of Miltonic diction. There are romantic ethos here and there, and it also has got all the agonies and ecstasies. It is said that Pururavas, in order to gain the hand of Urvashi, he actually could also visit the regions which was not possible for humans. There is a sort of Keatsian touch, you may at times call it a bit sensuous, though not sensual. We can find, we will go to the lines and then we will find, but before that let us have what M.K. Naik in his book Indian Literature in English, History of Indian Literature in English, where he says, the elaborate epic machinery has the look of an intruder in this narrative with its essentially romantic ethos. The entire poem is full of romantic ethos, and the best parts of the poem are those which offer a lyrical evocation of intense love with all its agonies and ecstasies. Now, let us have some lines from Urvashi, so that you can find that even though Aurobindo, who actually was writing about ancient legend king of Pururavas and Urvashi, but then he was so influenced by the romantic poets that you can find a description here. For example, I have taken some of the lines from Urvashi. He moved, he came towards her, see a leaf before a gust among the nearing trees, cowered. Pururavas seized her and caught her to her bosom, thrilled, clinging and shuddering, all her wonderful hair loosened and the wind seized and bore it streaming over the shoulders of Pururavas, and on his cheek a softness. She overborne, panting, with inarticulate murmurs lay, like a slim tree, half seen through driving hail, her naked arms clasping his neck, her cheek, and golden throat averted, and wide treble in her large eyes bewildered with their bliss. Now look at these lines, how we can find here a sort of sensuousness, a sensuous touch that may remind us of the famous romantic English poet John Keats, but it may appear to be sensuous, yet it is not sensual. Here it is the description of Pururavas and Urvashi, how when they met and how when they came across, what sort of description. And you see, the description that Aurobindo provides actually takes us back to majority of the romantic poets, especially John Keats, where you can also find the same sort of description, whether it is in Lamia or whether it is in Eve of St. Agnes or in some other my different. Now, moving to another epyllion of Aurobindo, as I had already mentioned, that all these three epyllions are centered in love. You might be thinking that we remember Aurobindo because of his Savitri, but my dear friends, initially Aurobindo was experimenting a different sort of pattern, and from there we can find there is a sort of transformation. So, even in the other poem entitled Love and Death, which is also based on an ancient legend, which is based on the legend of King Ruru and Priyambada, which is Pramadra, but then the poet has actually composed it like Priyambada in order that people may remember it well. And this Ruru was the son of Rishi Vrigu. So, a lot of Indian grounding is there, and this Priyambada was the daughter of the famous Menaka. And in their love episode it is found, because in every love there is bound to be some sort of tragedy, and the tragedy in this part is so that Priyambada dies of snake bite, and in order to get back or in order to find Priyambada, this Ruru actually undertakes even the journey of the Patala or the hell. Now see the height of romanticism that has been created by Aurobindo. But then it is written in a fashion that reminds us of a Homeric style, of Homeric pattern, the Greek legend of Orpheus and Eurydice, my dear friend. Ruru, as I told you, Ruru invades Patal to reclaim lost Priyambada. It is said, many critics have said that most of these lovers, whether it is Ruru or be it Pururavas, they actually what they do is they have failed and preferred personal felicity to the realization of world realization and total transformation. Now, there is something that actually is worth mentioning here, my dear friend. Now, Aurobindo, while he was depicting all these Indian kings, legends, Indian beauties and all, so there we could find a different sort of pattern. But then what he intends is that man can have different stages, and from one stage to other there can be a sort of progression, there can be a sort of transformation. My dear friends, Aurobindo also was not an exception, and Aurobindo also transformed himself, and the life that he spent at Pondicherry in the Aurobindo ashram, that actually transformed him, and that he has depicted or delineated in one of his poems, which we shall discuss later on. Here there is a need to mention two other major works by Aurobindo, which are entitled Ahana and Ilion. I have already told you that Aurobindo was influenced by Western philosophy and Western education. So, this Ahana was originally written at Pondicherry, and it has got 250 rhymed lines. Now, you might be wondering as to who Ahana is and why Ahana is so important. Ahana is actually the divine deity. Ahana is actually the divine deity, and Ahana comes once to see what is being done, and there from the hill Ahana sees, and when Ahana comes there, she actually finds Ahana, as I told you, is the divine down, a new change. So, who descends into the world and she is welcomed by hunters of joy, seekers of knowledge and climbers in quest of power. Now, these are all symbolical, my dear friends, and through this Aurobindo tries to convey a message to mankind, because when Ahana comes, these people actually gather and they try to greet. But then in this Ahana, in this poem Ahana, what happens is finally this Ahana deity tells man, thou shalt not suffer always nor cry to me, lured and forsaken. But how can that be? Only when they could recall, only when they could think of this deity without any bias, without any allurement and all. So, in Ahana was also written in blank verse, but here is one experiment that Aurobindo does, and the experiment is that he actually makes use of a lyrical feeling, and these lyrical feeling he brings there a sort of hexameter in English, classical hexameter in English, which is very rarely found in English, but he brings that. And when he asked for that to explain what he says, rhymes can be used for poems of reflective thought or lyrical feeling without resulting in melodic monotone. In fact, what he tries to do here is he introduces the classical hexameter to make it melodic, but then if it becomes very melodic, people may get tired of it, people may get weary of it, and that is why Aurobindo says that they can be used even for reflective thoughts and lyrical feeling without resulting in melodic monotone, my dear friend. Now, apart from Ahana, we should also think of Ilion, which is actually a more ambitious project than Ahana. It is also an exercise in Homeric and written in the heroic mode, but the basis of this is Trojan War. The basis of this is Trojan War, and the king Achilles and Penthesilea, who is the Amazonian queen, they are in the background, and the actual scene takes place only in a single day. We can come across inner epics. There are a few characters, not many characters as it happens in the case of epic, and it takes place only on a symbolic plane, my dear friend. It is often said that after Ilion only, there was a sort of prophetic vision in Aurobindo, and many people often say that these were just a prologue to the magnum opus of Aurobindo, which we shall discuss in the lecture to come. And what was that? That was actually Savitri. But before that, let us try to find out what underwent, what actually happened, how this transformation came, and how the poet actually describes that, how he mentions. He does that through one of his very important poems, which actually needs to be mentioned. The title of the poem is Transformation. If you read the lines of the poem, you can yourself find how the poet is progressing towards a different sphere, where he will become a spiritual, where he will talk about man's realization not only of the terrestrial forces, but of the cosmic vision that man can create, that man can generate in him or her. Let us look at some of the lines, and you will find that some of the lines themselves symbolize that there is undergoing a sort of transformation in the poet who used to talk about the romantic ethos and used to talk about the sensuousness touch. You have already found, my dear friend. Let us read some of the lines of the poem Transformation. My breath runs in a subtle rhythmic stream. It fills my members with a might divine, might divine. I have drunk the infinite like a giant's wine. Time is my drama or my peasant dream. Now on my illumined cells joy's flaming scheme, and changed my thrilled and branching nerves to find channels of rapture, opal and hyaline, for the influx of the unknown and the supreme. You see, before this there was no such use, but now he talks about for the influx of the unknown and the supreme. So the poet's progression now, I am no more a vessel of the flesh. So from this ethereal feeling, from this ethereal experience, that is experience of the body, experience of the materialistic tendency of man on this earth, a slave to nature and her leaden rule, I am caught no more in the senses' narrow mesh. My soul unhorizon widens to measureless sight. My body is God's happy living tool. My spirit is a vast sun of deathless light. Dear friends, it is said that when Aurobindo settled at Pondicherry, he actually entered a different phase where for a long time he did not speak. And at one place I have read that there were some people who also could throw stones, but yet he was unmoved, my dear friend, because he was entering a new sphere of spirituality, a new sphere of a cosmic vision that he could have, which he had started when being in the Alipur jail or in some other jail. Now, when we have a detailed discussion of this poem Transformation, you can find, my dear friend, you can find that this poem actually talks about not only about the poet, but he actually talks about the material world, the world which every now and then we are in, and the experiences that we have, but then there can be a mystical transformation as the poet also himself is experiencing. And this transformation may lead him to the joy of this spiritual world, and through what? Through tantric elements, through mantric elements, because they say that poetry or poem is a soul to soul communication, and here the mysticism that Aurobindo was having, that can come to support this view. From transformation from human to divine, you will find, from human to divine, and it is not the development of the body, but it is actually the development of the psyche. When you go inward and you can find the inner rhythms and that inner joy that is radiated on your face, my dear friend. The process of being without unnecessary epistemological concerns, because the knowledge that you are having on this earth, this knowledge may be transmuted, may be transformed for a better being, for a better sphere. And how is that possible, my dear friend? That is possible when you can start realizing, the inner chaos within you. And as man, all of us at a certain phase of our life, at a certain stage, we come across such feelings. But my dear friends, we have been saying that many of these poets who were imitating, of course one can say that in the beginning Aurobindo also imitated the Western tradition, but then Aurobindo did not have his mother tongue as Bangla, which he should have, but he did not have, as he left India only at the age of 7. But when he came to India and he had a changed notion, and then you will find what he did. Majority of these poets, whether we talk about Toru Dutt, we talk about Rabindranath, all these people, they also started searching resources from our ancient texts, like from Sanskrit, from some other language, and Aurobindo also translated many of the works from Sanskrit. And one such is, and there were different resources, for example, the hero and the nymph, which has been translated from Kalidascha Bikramorvarsi. So this was translated by Aurobindo, and the translation goes like this: the hero and the nymph. We have already talked about Urvashi, which also appears in Kalidascha Bikramorvarsi. And then another was from Bhartrhari. All of you are acquainted with the name of Bhartrhari. So when he translated Bhartrhari's works, he titled it The Century of Life. And then there were some devotional songs of Vidyapati and Chandidas also were translated by Aurobindo. And then Bidula from the Mahabharata. And then you will be surprised to note that while he was in jail, C.R. Das was actually fighting as an advocate. He was actually pursuing Aurobindo's case as a lawyer, and C.R. Das was himself a poet. He wrote in Bengali, but those were the poems, those he had called songs of sea. Sea has always been an inspiration, my dear friend, and Aurobindo translated that. If you look at the translation, you will find that it is not only a translation, but it is more than a sort of transcreation. What word is it thou singest? What tune my heart filled with, then it soon must overflow. What mystical unborn spirit is singing in thy white foam caves? What voice turns heaven to music from thy waves? So this is how he translated, my dear friend. Actually, while Aurobindo was having these transformations, there are people and critics who have had different sorts of experiences and different sorts of views about Aurobindo's levels of reality. In one such is Kees W.B. Bolle, who has found levels of reality in the poems of Aurobindo. The reality of existence, of absolute spirit, of bliss, of supermind, then of mind, psyche, life and matter, my dear friend. So, we will come across that unless and until you read Savitri, which is actually a magnum opus. And I am so much influenced by Savitri, and like me, majority of the people who have understood or who have heard the story of Savitri and Satyavan might be knowing the story, but the way this story has been given an epical sweep actually reminds us of what can be done by a poet who is not only a poet but a prophet, a poet who is not only a composer but a seer, a poet who has brought a sort of integrity through yoga in his works, and that he finds that how our mind can be concentrated in and transformed into a new sort of energy. So, when Aurobindo wrote Savitri, it is said that Savitri got many versions, many corrections, and it took 50 years, my dear friend, when the final Savitri came, and what he gave the name to this book was Savitri, a legend and a symbol. All of us are familiar with the Savitri story in the Mahabharata, where around 700 lines have been devoted to the depiction of Savitri and Satyavan. But then Aurobindo actually adds it further, and he actually presents it in a different way, though he does not change the storyline, but he actually makes it so that it actually appears as if Savitri could have travelled years and years to get that cosmic vision. Otherwise, no one can have that cosmic vision to save a human being who is already dead. And then Savitri, because of her sadhana, because of her yogic concentration and all, brings Satyavan back to life. So, this Savitri epic, which he has named as a legend and a symbol, it is actually a sort of, as Aurobindo himself says, it is a sort of poetic philosophy. It is a sort of poetic philosophy of the spirit and life, and an experiment in mystic poetry. Now, I think you are familiar with the mystic experience, where what you want to communicate, you do not communicate, fine, but you communicate in a different manner, fine. It is a sort of communication in a different manner, and a spiritual poetry cast into a symbolic figure. That is why he names it Savitri, a legend and a symbol. And this book, this epic is in 12 books, my dear friends, and it has got more than 20, it has got around 24,000 lines, 24,000 lines, my dear friend, 24,000 lines. It is a legendary verse. It is of course a retelling of the legend of Savitri and Satyavan, and it is in 49 cantos. It is often seen that some of the cantos are incomplete, but when we discuss, we will find how Aurobindo has given it not only a spiritual color, but he has also delineated it in such a manner that once you start reading Savitri, you will never feel that it is an incomplete work. The division of this book Savitri is, I mean, the book is in 3 parts, my dear friend. As I told you, the book has got 12 books. There are 12 books, and these 12 books are divided into 3 parts. The first part has book 1 to 3, where Aswapati's spiritual quest is there, and from the second part from book 4 to 8, it is about Savitri's upbringing, her birth, her upbringing, and then part 3, which comprises book 9 to 12, it is actually, this is the most important one of the book, where Savitri has a sort of encounter with death. I mean, the death god Yama, and Savitri advocates the case of Satyavan before Yama, and finally you will find the Yama has to be defeated before Savitri's yogic sadhana and Savitri's divine stature. So, there is a sort of forceful presence of the poet's own voice. It is through the internal yoga. Many people often say it is a sort of supramental poem, an epic of humanity and divinity of the death and life divine. So, this is how Savitri has been divided. We could have got ample time to discuss it, but since time runs short out of our schedule, so we shall be discussing further about Savitri in the next talk. But then we should also remember that when Aurobindo was writing it, what he had in mind is, he had in mind the descent of the divine to the earth, that man has got in him a sort of energy which also can be transformed. This energy can be transformed, and this transformed energy can have a better vision, can have a better phase, my dear friend. So, here we will find the yoga is being shown through Aswapati, who is Savitri's father, as we shall discuss further, and Savitri's penance has also been developed into a yoga, and 5,000 lines have been dedicated to it. It is often said that even though in Mahabharata there are only 700 lines dedicated to Savitri and Satyavan, but then how could Aurobindo make it 24,000 lines? And as I tell you time and again, my dear friend, once you start reading it, my aim through these lectures is not only to familiarize people with Indian poetry in English, but to let them realize that how powerful Indian poetry, Indian ethos, Indian strain, Indian influences can be there, and how we should not look only upon the West, rather we should also look upon the East, our own influences in the form of, not only in the form of Savitri and Satyavan, Urvashi and others, but there are quite a good number of. So, the confrontation between Yama god and Savitri has been expanded more than tenfold, my dear friend. So, it is now time that we have to stop this lecture. But before I stop, let me quote one line from Savitri, where it is said, "This world is a beginning and a base, where life and mind erect their structured dreams. An unborn power must build reality." And we will see how this reality emerges, how this reality can be transformed, and for that let us wait for the next lecture. Till then, thank you very much. Have a nice day.